Hello and welcome to the Young Texas and Reformed podcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. In this episode, I wanted to review an article I wrote called Mark Ward, the Conspiracy Theorist. So, Mark Ward recently published a pamphlet slash booklet in November 2020 called Bibliology for Beginners. What does the Bible say about the Bible? I'm going to do a full analysis on my channel in the coming weeks, but I ran across something that was entertaining, funny, too good not to comment on its own. It kind of is, I think, tangential to the main point of the book. So I thought that it would be good to kind of tease the series with just what you might expect, or what to expect from the coming analysis. So if you're familiar with Mark Ward's work, I wanted to first start on a point, what I call the first commandment of evangelical scholarship, which is thou shalt be nice, or thou shalt not be disagreeable, or, something to that effect. But he talks about Crossway's permanent edition, which is kind of a sore spot, I think, for a lot of people. But he says this, quote, "This means that when Crossway put out a permanent text edition of their popular and excellent translation, the English Standard Version, promising no more revisions, Christian people should have complained on social media nicely and written into Crossway to object nicely." Now, 2 points on this one. We'll get to the nice part in a little bit, but first and foremost, it's really comical that Mark Ward simultaneously lauds the ESV as so-called excellent, while also stating that apparently it's not excellent enough to stick around in its same state for a few years. Uh, they praise their modern versions while at the same time commenting on the fact that they have to be read in conjunction with another translation, or that they're going to need a revision in a couple of years. If it was such an excellent translation, why does it need to go through revision so often? Why does it need to be supplemented with another translation? If Crossway released a marketing campaign based on Mark Ward's idea, they wouldn't sell Bibles. I mean, could you imagine that? You go to Crossway's website, and it's the 2022 ESV, and it says, "An imperfect Bible for an imperfect church." I don't think it would sell a lot. I think that would be very, 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 very bad for optics. But that's what's being argued for in Mark Ward's book. And getting back to my first point, we see here that Ward really puts a high premium on niceness and agreeableness and being charitable and all this stuff. And I found that it's not necessarily being nice that they're all about. They really just don't like you being disagreeable. They don't like you being critical. You can be nice and critical at the same time. It's just what I've noticed. It's really just tone policing. So, what tone policing does here, I'm going to read a quote that I found on my buddy Steve Welch's Facebook page. The author's last name is Gordon, I believe, but I found it very pertinent to the discussion overall, and I think we can all benefit from reading it. So I'm going to read it off my phone here. It says, quote, "As the name implies, relativism absolutizes the relative and relativizes the absolute." Right? We can be certain in our uncertainty, but we can't be certain in our certainty. Tone of voice is an article of each human being's prudential judgment, meaning that, harsh or mellow, sweet or sour, loud or quiet, it cannot be judged according to the same absolute moral and logical standards that one's words can be. So, what they say isn't as important as how they said it. Radicals prefer to police their interlocutor's tone of voice precisely because so doing allows them to obviate the plain truth by swapping what is absolute, the material of what's been said, for what is relative, how they said it, their tone. He goes on, radicals also prefer it because they fear the fact that righteous men often harbor heated righteous anger in view of radical injustice. Radicals can avoid just chastisement by asserting that there is no proper occasion for indignation, which is a lie. What we're doing is just scholarly. You can't be upset about this. You have to be nice and agreeable about it because it's just science. Well, in a lot of cases, I don't think that's the case. This isn't just pure science. This is critical theories that are being applied to Scripture here. So it's ironic that Ward very loudly and repeatedly states that he seems to need people to be nice, while simultaneously offering some pretty extreme and harsh and uncharitable critiques of those that disagree with him. And in my opinion, he slaps people with the same hand he offers fellowship. And if perfect example of like this kind of persona that we're talking about here. And a lot of people, when I critique Mark Ward, they're like, Mark Ward's such a nice scholar. He's such a charitable person. Why are you being so uncharitable with him? And it's like, I'm not being uncharitable. I'm being critical, right? I'm offering critiques because I think that, for example, using the analogy of your son licking a cookie from the bottom to the top and the amount of germs on the cookie being equitous with the way the Bible was transmitted, I just don't think that's an appropriate analogy. I think that that's kind of silly. Now, disagree with me on that if you want. That's fine. It just is bizarre. It's bizarre. That's the only word I have for it. So in this article, I am going to demonstrate that Ward seems to have an extremely conspiratorial view of what he calls King James Version onlyists. And the reason I prefaced the main point of my article, the whole nice stuff, is, perhaps I'm not going to be very nice in this video. I'm not going to be very agreeable. I might be a little rambunctious, perhaps. But at the end of the article, I hope you see how funny, entertaining, and unserious this book is. What does the Bible say about the Bible? It's not a serious work. It's not serious. So on page 67, Ward offers what I believe to be the most honest definition of King James Version onlyism. It's the commonly employed version of King James Version onlyism. And I'll talk about that more in a sec. So he says, quote, King James Version onlyists insist that the King James Version is the only trustworthy translation of Scripture. It is, they say, the best translation of the best texts. So that's not really, that's such a broad definition of King James Version onlyism. If I'm being super charitable, when people use the term King James Version onlyism, they typically mean that of the, double inspiration and the kind of Ruckman, Gipp, Riplinger kind of idea, right? That's what people tend to mean, but they actually mean what Mark Ward is saying right here. When you press them and say, what do you mean by King James onlyism? They mean, well, people that only read the King James, people that think it's the best translation of the best texts. And there's a number of positions that are kind of incorporated into that view. So it's imprecise at best and overly broad and misinforming at worst. So I've been saying this for a long time, that men like Mark Ward and James White define King James Version onlyist as essentially everybody who reads a King James Version. If you were to survey, I don't have it on my desk, it's on my shelf, but if you were to survey James White's, table of 5 versions of King James onlyism, it's everybody from grandma who reads a King James to the majority text advocate to, Riplinger, Gipp, Ruckman. Everybody that is not a critical text advocate seems to be looped into the King James only category. And that is, again, when viewed in the best light, overly broad, sweeping, imprecise, and at worst, it's deceptive, it's misleading, it's inaccurate. So what my reader needs to recognize is that, and my listener, when people use the term King James Version onlyist, they're referring to people that are not critical text most of the time. And perhaps they don't even realize that's what they mean by it, but when you actually get Socratic with them and ask, well, what do you mean by that? How do you define this? And it always comes down to, people that are not okay with critical text. So in other words, it's people that are not critical text onlyists is what they have a problem with. So they seem to be talking about people that read a KJV broadly, regardless if they just like it or they have another reason for doing so. So after defining who a King James onlyist is, essentially everybody who has some sort of conviction about the King James, and just to pause on that, a translation being the best available translation of the best text, that is the ultimate standard for why we are to read a Bible translation. It is an accurate translation of a correct underlying Greek and Hebrew text. That's the standard. And so to kind of paint the picture as if that's not a good standard is really interesting. It's really interesting. You know, even when I read the ESV, I thought this is the best translation of the best text. That was my standard. And so that should be everybody's standard. That's why everybody reads the Bible they read if they've done any amount of thinking on the topic. Anyone that has an informed opinion about which translation they read, they say, well, I think it's the most accurate or the best translation of the correct underlying original language texts. That's not weird. That's not unusual for someone to believe that. But anyway, I'll continue. Ward says the most unhinged thing I have heard in recent history, and that is saying a lot, considering that CNN and MSNBC exist. So, quote, "It must be pointed out that most King James Version only Christians," and remember we're defining King James only as pretty much anyone who reads a King James, "believe that the vast majority of Christians who can read Greek and Hebrew are stupid, crazy, or evil, rather than simply wrong, dupes, dummies, or devils involved in a plot to undermine the Bible's teaching about Christ's deity. King James Version onlyism, in other words, is a conspiracy theory." I mean, you gotta laugh at it. This is not a serious take. This is not serious scholarship. This is absurd. This is absurdity, right? I mean, I hope you can see that. This is absurdity. In a remarkably matter-of-fact statement made by Mark Ward, he actually alleges that most King James Version only Christians, which at this point he's talking about TR guys, he's talking about grandma who reads a King James that has the conviction. I mean, he's talking about anyone that reads a King James. Most of these people, most of the 55% of people who enjoy a King James, 55% of the people who read a Bible read a King James. So most of these people believe that there is a vast conspiracy propagated by stupid, crazy, and evil Christians. He shockingly insinuates that people who read the King James believe that the vast majority of Christians who can read Greek and Hebrew are dupes, dummies, or devils involved in a plot to undermine the Bible's teaching about Christ's deity. No. There's no people that just read the King James because they like it. There's no people that read the King James because they have a conviction over the underlying text and translation. No. That, even though they say that that's the reason, no. They're actually conspiracy theorists. This is not serious. It can't be. He has to be joking. This is absurd. And okay, so let's take a pause and try to charitably gather what he's trying to say here, I guess. So I've seen the argument made, and I've used it, where you'll take a look at a textual variant and say, this is the TR reading, this is the critical text reading, right? Or even the majority text reading versus the critical text reading, right? There's a lot of cases where there's overlap between the TR and the majority text. And you'll just say, like, clearly Christ's divinity is heightened in one of these, in the TR and the majority text, and is diminished in the critical text. And the critical text scholars agree. They have a theory, a conspiracy theory, if you will, that Christians expanded on Christ's piety. This is not something that is a conspiracy theory. In fact, the conspiracy theory would go to the critical text advocate in that case, that there was this massive Roman conspiracy to alter the Bible and, implant a heightened, more deified version of Christ into the text. That's their conspiracy theory. But in any case, like that's mainstream. That's in textbooks. That's everywhere. That's in James White's King James only controversy, like as something that's true. So, so looking at this charitably, maybe he's looking at TR advocates pointing that out, and KJV only is pointing that out and saying, like, hey, like, you guys even admit it. You know, I don't know. That's the charitable take, but I mean, if I'm just being real, this is a silly take. This is not serious. This is not a serious take. Mark Ward is not a serious person. This is ridiculous. So instead of just taking the so-called King James onlyists at face value when they say, according to Mark Ward, the best translation of the best text, instead he says there is a vast number of Christians in the church that are conspiracy theorists. That's the academic take, apparently. That's the academic take. So I'm going to do my best to kind of look at this quote for just a brief moment. In the first place, the number of people that read, Greek and Hebrew is very small. And there are people in the TR and King James only camp that read Greek and Hebrew in some cases better than men like Mark Ward and James White. So I'm not exactly sure what, how do you have scholars in your own camp that read Greek and Hebrew and also that can't believe that Greek and Hebrew scholars are evil and wicked? Like, I guess, the vast majority of them. So the ones that are not King James only and TR only and, whatever you want to call it. It's just such a confused take. I don't think this is a real thing that people believe. So, or at least the majority of people believe. Secondly, this statement that he's made demonstrates that the foremost scholar on the King James Version, allegedly, hasn't the slightest clue who actually reads the King James Version. And I've thought this before, where, I read through Authorized a couple of times, and I did a pretty in-depth critique. Most of the time, it just sounded like Mark Ward has never interacted with somebody in recent history who actually reads and enjoys the King James. The people that he interacts with are the people that are like, recent pastor converts from King James onlyism to NKJV. He uses these men as props. But I don't think he really has a whole lot of engagement with people that actually read and enjoy the King James, just based on the way that he talks about it. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. So he also believes that no one can actually read the King James. So there's that. That's another real thing that Mark Ward believes. But it seems that in order to make sense of why people read the King James Version, instead of just taking these people at face value, Ward has concocted a world in which there is a massive group of conspiracy theorists. This must be, according to Ward, the only reason that someone might read the King James Version. Instead of just charitably stating that people who read the King James Version based on, it being the best translation of the best text, there has to be something more to it. You can't just disagree with modern scholarship. There's no good reason to do that. There must be a conspiracy afoot. So instead, he sends his reader off and has them actually believe this idea that most King James onlyists are just wide-eyed conspiracy theorists. Even though Ward states, quote, they say it's because the King James is the best translation of the best text, Ward posits that the true and actual reason is a rampant conspiracy theory plaguing the church. So you be the judge. If you think that's a serious take, if you think that's a serious statement, I don't know what to do for you, but I thought it was entertaining enough to make a video on. In any case, it's funny how critical text advocates have a very difficult time presenting their theology positively without slamming the King James Version and people who read it. In Ward's case, it seems that he just got done watching an episode of CNN, saw the QAnon strategy and was just like, hey, I can do that too. Right? Where essentially you find a conspiracy theory, which is out there, right? I'm sure, Ward's little conspiracy theorists exist. You kind of misrepresent the conspiracy theory, maybe use vague language, maybe say things they don't actually believe or maybe haven't actually said. And then you paint every single person from the group that you are trying to target as that fringe group of conspiracy theorists. CNN, MSNBC did this for months and months, for years about, so-called QAnon. And Mark Ward apparently was just like, hey, that worked pretty well. I'm going to try it in my book. I'm sure that there's people that believe as Mark Ward has described, just like there were and are people who believe things on anonymous message boards. But the same way that CNN used the QAnon thing to paint conservatives as, a certain sort of extremists, like kind of centrist right people, as, extremist conspiracy theorists, Mark Ward paints most King James onlyists as conspiracy theorists. It's the same strategy. And in my opinion, this is honestly embarrassing. This is embarrassing, and I'm not sure who exactly signed off on actually publishing these statements. This is not a serious take. It is such a bad take, in fact, that it is a conspiracy theory in itself. It's not grounded in data. It's not grounded in fact or reality. If Ward truly values being nice and charitable so much, it makes zero sense to call, most of 55% of people who read a Bible wide-eyed conspiracy theorists. Overall, I found the take pretty entertaining. It seems that he would rather believe that most King James Version readers are conspiracy theorists than actually look at their arguments and interact with them. Any time that he tries, he's tried to meaningfully engage, he just does the same thing. He misrepresents and, then calls the other people mean. And then it's, it's just an endless circle with Mark Ward. If anything, this should encourage my viewers who are TR advocates, because it shows that the critical text guys are now resorting to CNN, NBC level arguments because they can't justify their text. When it comes down to it, critical text advocates have openly admitted that they have no ultimate standard by which they judge text. James White said it in his debate versus Jeff Riddle, and that they don't have a text today. Dan Wallace repeatedly says it. So I'll leave my reader with a couple of quotes, 4 quotes to be exact, which are mostly for Mark Ward because I know that I live rent-free in his head. So Mark Ward on page 30 of his book says, quote, "It is found again in the words of Jesus who said, 'The scripture cannot be broken,' end quote." And then you have a scholar that Mark Ward happily endorsed on his blog recently, saying this, quote, "Even if the text of the Gospels could be fixed, and when viewed at the level of object and material artifact, this goal has never been achieved." So what is it? The scripture cannot be broken? Or, if the Gospels could be fixed, and when viewed at level of object and material artifact, this goal has never been achieved. Which is it? Which world do you want to live in? Do you want to believe that the scripture can't be broken, or do you want to believe that the scripture is broken? He goes on, and I think that Mark Ward should really be preaching to himself with this right here. So this last 2 quotes, I think, is just words of wisdom for my viewership and for Mark Ward. Quote, "Think about this. If we need the testimony of a professional historian to testify that the testimony of Luke the Apostle is reliable, then who is going to testify that the professional historian is reliable?" He goes on, "At some point, we're just going to have to trust someone. Why not let it be God?" And with that, that is the end of the Young, Textless, and Reformed podcast episode for today. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. Thank you for watching. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you all in the next video. Bye.